The wind moved softly across the desert plain, lifting dust into the fading light. Captain Elena Marquez stood still against the horizon, her silhouette cut by the sun's last fire, shoulders squared though her heart carried a weight only she could name. She had been many things in her life: daughter, soldier, comrade. But at that moment, she was something quieter, harder to define, a woman whose story had already been carved into the earth by both loss and survival. She had grown up in a small town where silence was broken only by church bells and the creak of screen doors. Her father worked long hours at the factory, hands worn from steel and grease, while her mother stitched uniforms late into the night. Elena had learned discipline not from orders barked on parade grounds, but from the steady rhythm of her family's sacrifices. She joined the army not out of rebellion, but because she felt the pull of responsibility. To her, service was not glory. It was an unspoken promise to protect the fragile threads that held ordinary lives together. Even years later, she could recall the first day of training. Boots pressed against gravel, the acrid smell of dust and sweat, the endless echo of shouted commands. Some recruits had folded beneath the strain, but she endured, not because she was fearless, but because she understood fear was part of the pact. She remembered standing in line at dusk, muscles trembling, lungs burning, her hands raw from the rifle's grip, yet her mind whispering, "Hold steady. Just hold steady." Her deployment to Afghanistan had been like stepping into another lifetime. The land was stark, both cruel and beautiful. Mornings carried the chill of mountains, while afternoons burned with unrelenting heat. Villages stood fragile against the expanse, their walls pockmarked from decades of conflict. Children watched from doorways with eyes too old for their years. Elena moved through those days with a quiet alertness, scanning rooftops, listening for the hum of drones, the distant pop of gunfire. She had never believed in invincibility, but in resilience. What she had not expected was how heavy the nights would feel. After the adrenaline drained, silence became its own kind of enemy. Lying beneath canvas, she could hear her heartbeat louder than the cicadas outside. Sometimes she dreamed of her mother's hands sewing fabric, the click of needles steady as prayer. Other nights, she dreamed of falling, her boots unable to grip the earth. Each morning, she rose before dawn, tying her hair with deliberate precision, a ritual that reminded her she still had control over something. There were moments, rare but searing, that marked her forever. She once found herself sitting with a local woman outside a crumbling wall, neither able to speak the other's language. The woman had pressed a piece of bread into Elena's hands, her eyes soft despite the war around them. Elena never forgot the weight of that bread, warm, fragile, given freely by someone who owed her nothing. But there were darker memories, too. The firefights that tore through the air, sand whipping into her mouth as bullets sparked against stone. The radio static that carried half-heard words, some of which never returned. Comrades lost to the kind of silence that fell heavier than the desert night. She carried those absences like stones in her chest, reminders that courage and grief were always entwined. Through it all, there was something in her that refused to bend. When exhaustion pressed down, when shadows lengthened and hope thinned, she would place her hand against the rough fabric of her sleeve and remind herself, "I am still here. I am still standing." It was not defiance in the way outsiders might imagine. It was survival, a stubborn pulse that insisted her story was not finished. Years later, when people would ask her why she kept going, she never offered easy answers. She could not explain the strange alchemy of duty and love, of fear and resolve. She only knew that service had shaped her into someone who no longer feared breaking. She had already broken 1,000 times, in the dust, in the silence, in the sharp echo of gunfire. And yet, she had always risen. In quieter moments now, back home, she would sit with a mug of coffee cooling in her hands and let her mind wander. Photographs lined the walls, some faded, some vibrant. A folded flag rested in a case near the window. Outside, children played in the street, their laughter rising like a hymn. She would watch them and feel something settle inside her, The understanding that the pain she endured, the scars invisible to most, were the cost of ensuring that laughter could still exist. There were still nights when she woke with her fists clenched, the echo of orders or explosions ringing through her dreams. Yet each morning, she chose to rise. She tied her hair with the same precision, laced her boots though no march awaited, and stepped forward into whatever the day demanded. For Elena, beginnings were never clean lines. They were threads woven through hardship and grace, through silence and survival. Her story had no single starting point. It was a river that carried her, sometimes against her will, yet always forward. And though the world once thought her lost, she had walked back with proof of her endurance, her spirit unbroken. She was not defined by the moment she dragged her captors across the earth, nor by the shadows she had survived. She was defined by the quiet, steadfast truth that through it all, she remained herself, a soldier, a woman, a survivor who still believed in light. And that was the beginning that mattered most. The mountain air was thin that morning, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Elena adjusted her pack and scanned the ridge ahead, her boots crunching against gravel that shifted under each step. The patrol had been long, winding through narrow paths where the rocks fell away into valleys of dust and silence. Around her, the squad moved like shadows, each breath measured, each glance sharpened by the knowledge that danger in this land did not announce itself. It waited, patient as the desert itself. She could sense it before it arrived, the stillness, the unnatural pause in the wind. Then, the world broke open. A crack split the air, followed by the thunder of gunfire. Dust exploded around them, bullets tearing at stone, and the mountain that had moments ago stood in solemn silence became a trap of echoing chaos. Elena dropped low, the sting of gravel biting into her palms. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as she returned fire, her weapon kicking hard against her shoulder. Around her, the voices of her comrades carried through the radio, orders, warnings, fragments of breathless shouts. She tried to anchor herself to the rhythm of her training, to the repetition that had once steadied her hands. But nothing in training prepared you for the way the earth itself seemed to shudder when mortars hit close, or the way smoke could blind you with the scent of burning dust. A scream cut through the gunfire, raw and immediate. Elena turned, glimpsing one of her squad mates sprawled against the rocks, blood spreading dark across his uniform. For a split second, the world narrowed to that single image, the weight of mortality pressing down, heavy as stone. She forced herself to move, crawling toward him through the spray of dirt, dragging his body to cover with her strength straining at every pull. She spoke his name over and over, not as a command but as a plea, as though the sound of it might hold him in place. The firefight stretched into hours, time unraveling in bursts of violence and desperate silence. By the time the last shots faded into the mountains, Elena's throat burned from grit and her body shook from exhaustion. They had survived, but survival never felt like triumph. It felt like something narrower, something that demanded a part of you each time, leaving pieces scattered in the dust. That night, under a sky riddled with cold stars, she sat apart from the others. The firelight flickered against her face, shadows dancing across her eyes. She pressed her palms together, feeling the raw cuts left by the rocks, and tried to steady her breathing. Around her, the quiet conversations of soldiers drifted, half-jokes, murmurs of home, the sharp exhale of cigarettes. Yet for her, the night pressed heavier. She thought of the man whose blood had stained her hands, of his laughter only days before, of the empty space he now left behind. In those moments, she realized war was not only fought in the clash of rifles or the thunder of mortars. It was fought in the silence afterward, when memory turned sharper than any blade. The weeks that followed blurred into an unrelenting cycle of patrols, brief rest, and sudden violence. Every step into the open was a wager. Every shadow might hold an enemy. Yet what weighed most on Elena was not the constant threat, but the erosion of what she once thought unshakable. Sleep no longer brought rest. It brought flashes of faces, echoes of screams, the sharp sting of loss replayed with cruel precision. She did not speak of it. She carried it quietly, as she always had. When the weight grew unbearable, she would grip her dog tags, the metal biting into her fingers, and breathe until the trembling eased. Her comrades saw her calm and thought it unbreakable. Only she knew it was a fragile calm, one she rebuilt each day from the fragments left behind. Then came the day that tested even that fragile thread. A mission gone wrong, the kind that unravels before you can name the mistake. She and her team were cut off, their radios choked with static, the ridgeline crawling with enemy fire. When capture came, it was not in a blaze of resistance, but in the slow suffocation of options. Hands bound, weapons torn from reach, she felt the desert press down on her like a weight determined to bury her whole. The march into captivity was long and cruel. The sun burned overhead, the dust choked her throat, and the laughter of her captors rang sharp against the emptiness. Her wrists ached from the rope, her shoulders screamed with every stumble. Yet even then, even as fear pressed close, there was something within her that refused to bow. She remembered the bread given to her once by that local woman, the softness of that gesture in the midst of war, and she held on to it. A reminder that humanity endured, even here, even now. At night, when the guards fell silent and the desert winds moved cold against her skin, Elena would close her eyes and hear the faint echo of church bells from her hometown. She would see her mother's hands at work, the steady rhythm of stitching cloth. She would breathe into those memories, drawing strength from them like water in a dry land. Her struggle was no longer only survival of the body. It was survival of spirit, of the part of her that still believed in returning, in standing again on her own feet. And though the world might have thought her broken, she carried inside her a quiet defiance, one that waited, patient as the desert itself, for its moment to rise. The night air was thin, laced with smoke from the captor's fire and the bitter scent of unwashed earth. Elena sat with her back pressed against the stone wall of the makeshift camp, wrists bound, ankles raw from the rope that had dragged her through the dust. The desert stretched endless beyond the firelight, vast, silent, and watching. She felt the tremor of exhaustion in her muscles, yet beneath it all, a quiet hum of something steadier remained, the refusal to surrender the last thread of herself. The guards laughed softly in their own tongue, the sound jagged in the stillness. They passed bread between them, their rifles leaning against the rocks. Elena studied them the way a falcon studies prey, not with hatred but with clarity. Every movement, every careless gesture etched itself into her mind. She had no illusions about what might come, prison, bargaining chip, or worse. But the thought that anchored her, more than fear, was the knowledge that her life was not hers alone. It belonged to the mother who stitched uniforms by candlelight, to the comrades whose names were now carved into stone, to the children back home whose laughter deserved protection. To fall silent here, to vanish without resistance, was unthinkable. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing into the rhythm of memory. She recalled the voice of her drill sergeant years ago. Survival isn't luck. It's choice, over and over, until your body remembers. Her fingers flexed against the rope, testing. The fibers bit into her skin, but beneath their bite was possibility. The hours crept forward. Stars spilled like shards of glass across the black sky. One by one, her captors drifted into the fog of half-sleep, their laughter softening to the rise and fall of breathing. Only one remained watchful, though even he fought the heaviness of his eyelids. Elena listened to every sound, the snap of the firewood, the shift of gravel beneath boots, the faint whistle of wind cutting through the valley. She waited not for luck, but for the moment discipline had taught her to see. The fracture in the pattern. When it came, it was a sliver of silence. The watchman leaned his head against the rock, his rifle slipping just far enough. In that instant, Elena's body moved with a precision born of years. She twisted her wrists against the rope, ignoring the sting as fibers tore skin. Pain flashed white-hot, but it was not her enemy. It was proof she was alive, moving, refusing. The rope gave way, with a snap muffled by the crackle of the fire. She lunged, faster than thought, seizing the rifle before the guard's hand could reclaim it. A single blow dropped him, his weight crumpling into the dust with a dull thud. The other stirred, but hesitation is fatal in the dark. Elena turned, the weapon steady in her grasp, her voice low and commanding in words they understood well enough. Down. Fear works quickly. They froze, eyes wide, the arrogance of captors bleeding into sudden silence. One by one, she bound their wrists with the same rope that had cut her own, her hands steady despite the tremor in her veins. The firelight painted her face in shifting shadows, equal parts soldier and survivor, a figure drawn from something deeper than training. The march back through the desert began with dawn breaking pale across the horizon. Elena walked in front, her rifle slung, her prisoners stumbling behind, their eyes lowered to the ground. Each step sent dust rising around her boots, the air sharp with morning cold. Birds circled high above, their cries carrying across the emptiness like a hymn. Her body ached with exhaustion, her skin torn, her throat raw from thirst, yet she carried herself with the calm weight of someone who had crossed a threshold. Fear had not vanished, it never truly did, but it no longer ruled her. What filled her instead was the steady pulse of resolve, the quiet knowledge that she had turned captivity into defiance, despair into movement. As the sun climbed, heat shimmered against the rocks, and her mind wandered. She thought of the faces of her squad, of the man she had dragged from gunfire though his life slipped away. She thought of her father's calloused hands, her mother's threadbare smile, the echoes of home stitched into her every step. She felt the ropes biting her prisoners' wrists as they had bitten hers, and she understood the strange symmetry of it all. By the time the first distant shapes of Allied vehicles appeared across the ridge, her strength was nearly spent. Dust trails rose in the distance, voices carried faintly on the wind. Relief stirred in her chest, not as triumph, but as something gentler, a release of breath she hadn't known she was holding. The soldiers who met her stopped in stunned silence. The image was one that would linger in their memory long after, a lone figure walking out of the desert, her uniform torn, her face shadowed with grit and weariness, dragging behind her 9 bound men who had once been her captors. She said nothing at first, simply handed over the rifle, her eyes steady but unreadable. Later, when asked how she had managed it, she offered no elaborate account. She only shrugged, her voice quiet. I chose not to stop. That night, in the safety of the camp, she lay on a cot beneath a canopy of unfamiliar stars. Her body throbbed with every bruise, her hands burned with every cut, but for the first time in weeks, her breathing came without a fight. She traced the outline of the dog tags at her throat and let the weight of the day settle. What she carried forward from that night was not the image others saw, a soldier dragging captors across the earth, but the truth only she knew, that strength was not loud, not always a roar. Sometimes, it was the quiet refusal to surrender, the choice made again and again to rise, even when everything demanded she fall. And as sleep pulled her gently under, Elena felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not triumph, not even peace, but a small, steady ember of hope, faint, but alive. Years later, the desert still lived in her dreams. Not as fire and gunfire, but as silence, the endless stretch of horizon, the sting of wind carrying dust against her skin, the weight of footsteps measured mile by mile. Elena Marquez had long since left the war behind in body, yet in quiet moments, when the world softened into stillness, she felt its echoes hum within her like an old wound. She lived now in a small town not far from where she had grown up. The days were slower, anchored by ordinary rhythms, the creak of her porch chair, the whistle of a kettle, the laughter of children riding bicycles past her gate. Neighbors knew her as the woman who kept her garden tidy, who waved with a gentle smile, who sometimes stood at dusk with her eyes turned far beyond the horizon. Few asked about her years overseas. Fewer still knew the story in full. Yet Elena carried it all with her, the fear, the fire, the walk back across the desert with prisoners bound behind her. Not as a badge, not as a legend, but as truth. A truth that had reshaped her, smoothed away illusions, and carved something both tender and unbreakable into her soul. On her kitchen wall, above the table where she often drank her morning coffee, hung a single photograph. It showed her squad-lined shoulder to shoulder, dust rising around their boots, sunburnt faces squinting into the glare. Some in the picture were gone now, names etched into memorial stone, their absence a hollow that no ceremony could fill. Elena often paused before the photograph, tracing their faces with her eyes, letting memories settle like a prayer. The nights were harder. Sometimes she woke with her hands clenched, the phantom feel of rope cutting into her wrists. Other times she dreamed of walking again through the valley, the sound of footsteps behind her, the prisoners silent as shadows. She would sit on the edge of her bed, heart pounding, and remind herself of the present, the softness of her quilt, the hum of a refrigerator, the faint bark of a dog down the street. She had learned that healing was not the absence of memory, but the making of peace with it. When she spoke at schools or veterans' gatherings, her words were quiet, steady. She never dramatized, never sought to stir awe. Instead, she spoke of endurance, of the small choices made in the darkest hours. She told them strength was not the absence of fear, but the will to move forward despite it. Her hands trembled sometimes as she spoke, but her voice carried a calm that stilled the room. One autumn afternoon, she visited a memorial park where rows of stone markers stretched across the grass. The air was crisp, leaves scattering in bursts of color. She walked slowly, her boots pressing against the earth with deliberate care. At one stone, she paused, kneeling to brush away fallen leaves. The name carved there belonged to a friend whose laughter had once filled long patrols, whose absence she still felt like a shadow at her side. She bowed her head, letting silence speak the words her voice could not form. Standing again, she felt the chill air fill her lungs, sharp and clean. For a moment, she closed her eyes and heard distant echoes, the crunch of gravel under boots, the crackle of radio static, the low murmur of comrades beside her. Then, as she opened them, she saw the sunlight spilling warm across the stones, and she understood something she had carried all along. Survival was not just for oneself. It was a way of carrying forward the lives that could not. Back at home that evening, Elena sat on her porch as twilight gathered. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and wood smoke. In the distance, a train horn drifted low and mournful across the hills. She wrapped her hands around a mug of tea, the warmth grounding her, and let her gaze rest on the children playing beneath the streetlight. Their laughter rose bright and unbroken, unshadowed by the weight she knew so well. She smiled, not with triumph, but with quiet gratitude. Everything she had endured, everything she had carried, had led to this moment, the sound of joy that might never have existed if not for those who bore the burden before it could reach the innocent. Elena knew her story would never leave her. It was written into her skin, into the scars that marked her wrists, into the steady calm in her eyes. But she also knew she was not only that story. She was more: daughter, neighbor, survivor, guardian of memory, bearer of hope. As the sky deepened into night, she whispered a single thought into the silence, not a prayer, but a promise: I will keep walking forward. And in that simple vow, there was both closure and beginning. For she had not been lost, not truly. She had returned, changed, scarred but unbroken. And in her quiet resilience, she stood not just as a veteran, but as a beacon of hope for others who carried battles within their hearts. The first snow of the year had fallen softly in the night, laying a pale quilt across Elena Marquez's garden. She stood at the window in the early dawn, watching the slow drift of flakes still lingering in the air, catching the light as though the sky itself were scattering small fragments of memory. Winter always brought her back to reflection, perhaps because silence seemed deeper then, or because the weight of cold reminded her of long nights when warmth was a fragile thing to hold on to. That morning, she carried her coffee to the kitchen table and opened a small wooden box she kept tucked away on the bottom shelf. Inside were letters, some written to her, some written by her, but never sent. The paper had yellowed at the edges, ink faded slightly, but each line still pulsed with the life of the moments in which they had been written. She pulled out one, folded carefully, addressed only with a first name, Luis. Her brother. He had been only 17 when she left for deployment, too young to understand why she went, too angry to forgive her for going. Their last conversation before she shipped out had been sharp, a flare of words neither could take back. She had promised herself, back then, that she would write him properly, explain what she could not in person. But the war had swallowed time and silence in equal measure, and though she had written the words, the letter had never found its way into an envelope. Now, years later, she unfolded it slowly, her fingers tracing the creases as if reopening not just paper, but memory itself. Luis, she had written, I know you think I chose the war over you, but that isn't true. I chose to protect the space where your laughter could still exist. If I come back, I'll tell you everything. If I don't, at least you'll know I loved you enough to walk into fire for it. The words caught in her throat even now, though she read them silently. Her brother had grown older in her absence, had forgiven her in his way, but she still felt the weight of that unsent truth pressing against her heart. She sat back, closing her eyes, letting memory fill the room around her. She could almost hear the voices of her squad mates, the steady rhythm of boots on dirt, the low rumble of trucks moving across barren roads. But intertwined with those echoes came the softer sounds she'd tried to protect, the hiss of her mother's cooking, the familiar cadence of her brother's guitar, the simple grace of home. A knock on the door stirred her from thought. It was a neighbor, a young mother from 2 houses down, her little boy clutching a broken toy in his hands. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said shyly, but I thought maybe you'd know how to fix this. You've always been so good with your hands. Elena smiled, inviting them in. She took the toy gently, turning it over in her palms. As she worked, she showed the boy each step, her voice soft, patient, careful to let him feel capable, not helpless. When the toy clicked back together, the child's eyes lit with wonder. Thank you, he whispered, hugging it close. As they left, Elena lingered at the door, the cold air brushing her face. She realized then that healing sometimes came not in grand gestures, but in these small exchanges, in offering steadiness where once there had been only fire. That evening, she returned to the letter. She sat at her desk, pen poised, and for the first time in years, began writing again. Not to the past, but to the present. Luis, she wrote anew, I kept something from you. A letter I never sent. It carried my fear and my love, both too heavy to give you then. But I want you to have them now, not as apology, but as truth. I came back because of you, because of the thought of your music filling our home again. Everything I endured was so that you could live untouched by that darkness. Her words flowed steadily, not rushed, not strained, just honest. When she finished, she folded the letter and sealed it, placing it aside with the quiet certainty that this one would not remain hidden. Later that night, she stepped outside onto the porch. The snow glowed softly under the moon, the world hushed and tender. She drew her coat tighter around her shoulders and breathed deeply of the crisp air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and laughter floated from a house where lights still burned. Life went on, in its fragile, precious way. Elena stood there for a long time, the letter resting on the table behind her, and felt something loosen in her chest. The war had given her scars that would never fade, but it had also carved a deeper well of love, a sharper clarity for what mattered. She had walked through fire and carried silence for years, but now, with each letter, each word spoken, she was learning that sharing was also a form of survival. When she finally turned back inside, she whispered, almost without realizing, I came home. And for the first time, the words did not feel unfinished. The hospital wing smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, a strange mingling of sterility and comfort. Elena moved quietly through the corridor, her boots echoing softly against the polished floor. She had never imagined she would return here, not as a patient this time, but as a visitor. The VA center carried its own gravity, each room filled with untold stories, each face etched with burdens that words often failed to release. She was here for Daniel Ortiz, a man she had served beside in the desert. They hadn't spoken in years, not since their unit fractured into different assignments. When the message came through that he was here, recovering from a surgery that bore more scars than stitches, she hadn't hesitated. She remembered his laughter on nights when laughter felt impossible, remembered how he once carried her rifle when her shoulder gave out after a brutal march. Friendship like that never faded, no matter how much silence stretched between. She found him in a quiet room, propped up by pillows, sunlight slanting across the blankets. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes lifted when she stepped through the door. Recognition sparked, then softened into something like relief. "Elena," he said, his voice worn but steady. "I thought maybe I dreamed that you'd come." She pulled a chair beside him, her movements unhurried. "I'm here," she answered gently. "And it's real." For a while they spoke of simple things, weather, the nurse's kindness, the books stacked on his nightstand. But under the lightness ran a current both of them felt. War had marked them in ways no casual talk could erase. Silence eventually settled, and Daniel broke it first. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "why we came back when so many didn't?" The question hung heavy in the room. Elena let it breathe before she answered. "Every day," she admitted. "At first, it felt like a weight I couldn't carry. But I think maybe we were meant to keep their voices alive in our own ways. To make space for their stories and the lives we're still living." Daniel's eyes glistened. He nodded, his hand trembling slightly against the blanket. Elena reached across, resting her palm over his. His skin was fragile now, but the bond between them was not. Outside, a nurse passed with a cart, the rattle of wheels fading quickly. The world moved on, but inside that room, time seemed to slow into something more sacred. Elena felt it in her chest, the quiet reverence of two souls who had carried the same fire, who still carried its ashes. Later, as the sun dipped lower, Daniel grew tired. His words came softer, drifting between wakefulness and sleep. Elena sat beside him, watching the light turn golden, watching the shadows stretch. She thought of all the rooms like this across the country, all the veterans sitting in silence, some alone, some with companions, each carrying fragments of memory that would never make it into history books. When Daniel finally drifted into rest, she rose carefully, tucking the blanket closer around him. She lingered at the doorway, her gaze tender. It wasn't just him she was leaving in that room. It was every shared memory, every moment that bound them to a time neither could fully explain. Outside, the air was crisp, touched by evening. The parking lot glowed under orange lamps, and beyond it stretched the city, with its hum of traffic and scattered lights. Elena paused on the steps, breathing it in. The day had been heavy, but not hopeless. There was still meaning to be made, even in quiet rooms where voices faltered. That night, back at home, she lit a single candle on her kitchen table. She sat in its soft glow with her journal open, pen poised. Writing had become her way of holding space for others, of carrying forward the echoes that might otherwise fade. She began a new entry. "Today I sat with Daniel. We didn't need to tell the whole story. Our silence said enough. I think that's what survival really means. Finding the courage to sit with the silence and still let love fill the space. If I carry anything from the war, let it be that, the knowing that even in pain, there can be gentleness." Her words spilled slowly, tenderly, each one a thread weaving together memory and meaning. When she finished, she closed the journal and held her hands over the candle flame, feeling its warmth. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the world rested in stillness. Elena lifted her eyes to the window, watching the night sky. Somewhere, miles away, Daniel slept in his hospital room. Somewhere, across the years, those they lost remained alive in memory. And here, in her small kitchen, Elena sat with all of it, the grief, the love, the fragile beauty of survival. She whispered softly, as though to the night itself. "You are not forgotten." And for a moment, the room seemed to answer back with silence so full, it felt like grace.